Good afternoon, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session, which is being recorded. We are encouraging you to participate in today's discussion based on the features made available in the audience console. You can view slides, hear the presenter via the main stage, submit questions to the presenter through the Q&A box, views closed captioning, and much more. This afternoon, we welcome Dr. John Hayes, Penn State professor and director of the Sensory Evaluation Center here at Penn State. Most foods and consumer goods that you eat or touch every day have probably been optimized by a sensory scientist. The Sensory Evaluation Center at Penn State trains the next generation of sensory and consumer scientists by using people to study products and products to study people. Dr. Hayes will discuss the science behind taste tests using spicy foods as an example. He will explain how industrial researchers optimize the level of heat for different market segments and why some people like spicy foods and what to do if you overdo it with the hot sauce. Dr. Hayes uses quantitative and qualitative methods to study consumer behavior, mostly but not exclusively related to foods and beverages. He also studies the biology of chemosensation, including genetic differences across individuals and COVID-related anosmia. Hayes' works has been funded by the NIH, the USDA, commodity groups, and food companies. He's published over 135 peer-reviewed articles and successfully mentored over 25 trainees who have gone on to successful careers in the food industry and academia. His research has been featured in media like The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, NPR, BBC, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and PBS NOVA. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hayes. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work we do. So what I wanted to start off today was talking to you about what we do at the Sensory Evaluation Center. Sensory Evaluation Center at Penn State has existed in some form or another, really dating back to the 1970s or even the 1960s at the Meats Lab that is right next to Beaver Stadium. There have been faculty members here who have done research in this area trying to understand what foods people like. I was hired in 2009 to take over the center, and I've been working in this area ever since. So you might want to know, well, what is sensory evaluation? And it can be defined as a discipline used to evoke, measure, analyze, and interpret products that evoke sensations in us. So this can be very much focused on the product. So we are often using people as the instrument to study product. And so in that case, we really want to remove all those biases that you might bring to it. So we're not market researchers. We're not interested in the branding. We're not interested in the value proposition. We don't care if you like Coke or Pepsi. Instead, what we want to do is we want to do blind taste tests to find out if you like Formula A better than Formula B. So you can see that here with the two photographs that I'm showing you. I'm showing you a staged photograph, a very old one, in fact, of people doing a quote unquote blind taste test. We don't actually use blindfolds because then the pudding goes everywhere. This is more a matter of a blind taste test in the way a medical trial is blinded. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, what you're actually looking at there is a photograph of one of the 12 taste test booths we have here at University Park. So we provide the food through a serving hatch. We collect all the data on a computer. We use controlled lighting and controlled airflow to minimize odors to ensure that everyone evaluates the product under the exact same lighting conditions and so on. And so many of our graduates have gone on to work for major food companies and other packaged consumer goods companies. So sensory and consumer scientists are hired obviously by food companies coming out of a food science program, but some people are a little surprised to find out that our graduates also work for companies like GSK Consumer Healthcare. So you might have a product like Chapstick or Centrum, or they might work for Johnson & Johnson Skincare. So you'll see a product like Neutrogena or Aveeno. Those have been optimized by a sensory and consumer scientist. And then some of our graduates have gone on to work for Boston Beer Company. You know them as Sam Adams, but they're also the same people that make Truly, or New Glarus, which is a very well-known regional brewery in the upper Midwest. And then places like PepsiCo, who owns Quaker Oats, and then Ocean Spray, which is a farmers co-op based out of Massachusetts. And of course, we are Penn State, so we wouldn't be complete if we didn't have graduates that work both at Mars Wrigley and at Hershey's Chocolate Company. So these are some of the products that our graduates have worked on. So what I wanted to tell you about today was this is the most biology that you're going to get. So I promise that this won't be too overwhelming. But over the last 15 years, we've really understood the biology of chemosensation much, much more, really based on work that started in the late 90s that just resulted in last year. David Julius won the Nobel Prize for work on so-called TRP receptors. And these TRP receptors are normally thermal sensitive channels. So they actually respond to really high heat or really low temperatures. So they're cold pain or heat pain. They're really meant as a warning system for the body. But it just so happens that TRPV1 is the receptor that was first identified in 1997. And it is the heat pain receptor that responds when you warm it up to about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. It starts to trigger a burning sensation in your mouth. And the way it does this is the chili pepper plant evolved a molecule called capsaicin that fits into that receptor like a lock and a key, just like you learned about in middle school biology. And that lock, when that key activates that lock, you actually activate that receptor at normal body temperature. So now your brain is getting a signal that my mouth is on fire, even though your mouth actually isn't on fire. And so this is meant to prevent predation. So if you're a plant, you can't run away. You can't keep an animal from eating you. So you evolve these chemicals to make you so unpleasant that nobody wants to eat you. So the squirrels avoid you and don't eat the chili plants. So the one that we're talking about today is TRPV1, and it's known as the capsaicin receptor. But of course, humans actually like spicy food, even though this is innately aversive. Here's a photograph of a young boy who'd never actually had an atomic fireball before, and his mother gave him an atomic fireball and took pictures of it. And this is what he looked like when he first tried it. And as you can see, as he went along in this time course, he was just really not enjoying this. So this was a really aversive sensation. So then why did Vasco da Gama get on a ship and sail halfway around the world to go looking for spices? Or why did Columbus bring the chili plant back from the New World and bring it back to Europe and then have it spread to Thailand and China within 30 years on wooden sailing ships? The chili plant originally was domesticated 2 different times, once in central Mexico and once in Peru, so that it very quickly spread around the world once transatlantic trade was established between Europe and North America. So we can think about this as a question of market segmentation. So I have a little thought experiment for you. So I want you to imagine someone who's a white male. They're a highly successful businessman. They make more than $1 million a year. They were born in England in 1948. They were raised by their parents. They have multiple siblings. They were divorced, but they're happily remarried now. They have grown children. They like to winter in the Alps. Must be a nice life. And they love dogs. So imagine who this consumer is in your head. And I want you to think about which one of these people fits that description. And in fact, both Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles can be described demographically in the exact same way using this criteria. So obviously, Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles are very, very different in other aspects of their life that we just don't capture with simple demographics. And so market researchers have known this for many decades. And this led to the invention of a field known as psychographics, where we're, instead of trying to just look at the demographic characteristics of who likes a product, instead we look at the different behavioral attributes that can separate people into different categories. And so my research group has spent a lot of time looking at segmentation from a biological basis. So sometimes we'll do cheek swabs and we'll look at DNA. Other times we'll look at personality traits. We're really trying to understand why some people eat some foods that other people really don't like. So we really need to look beyond simple demographics. And of course, the food industry already knows this. The food industry didn't need us at Penn State to tell them that, because we can see the market segmentation that readily occurs in some products. So imagine you go to the grocery store and you're going to buy some salsa. There's the mild salsa, the medium salsa, and the hot salsa. And you already know which one of those categories you probably fall into based on your prior lived experience. And you might even buy a different product for a different situational context. So if I'm having a Super Bowl party where I don't know if everyone's a real chili head, I might buy one product. But if I'm a chili head at home and I really, really like that spicy food for my own family's consumption, maybe I'm going to buy the hotter product. So market segmentation is one of these things that food companies can use to really optimize products for different groups. So let's imagine that we're going to optimize this salsa. Over here on the left-hand side, you'll see a scale that's known as the 9-point hedonic scale. This is probably the most famous scale in all of food science. And it was originally developed by the US Army back in the 1950s when they were trying to optimize military rations, because what they had discovered was the quality of the food really affects troop morale and the effectiveness of the warfighter. So they wanted to try and figure out how to make the food better. And they had to develop the techniques to do that. This tool very quickly spread to the food industry, and it's still in use today, 7 years later, and it's widely used by the food industry. So I simply ask you how much you like this. We do this with hundreds of consumers that we bring into the laboratory, and we ask them, do you like this product? You rate it an 8. Do you like this product? You rate it a 6. I can do some statistics, and I can compare 2 different prototypes in a blind taste test to figure out which one you like better. But one of the other techniques that we use is called the just about right scale. So a just about right scale, you can think of this as like Goldilocks. She didn't like the one porridge because it was too hot. She didn't like the other porridge because it was too cold. One bed was too lumpy, the other bed was too soft, and so on and so forth. Well, you can imagine that I could just ask consumers, how much cilantro do you like in your salsa? Because that's a very polarizing attribute. Some people really like cilantro and other people don't. We'll come back to why later. But maybe I want to optimize that. So I could just ask people, do you need more? Do you need less? And so when I do that, I could get data that looks something like this. So in this case, I've targeted consumers who want medium salsa. So I'm not looking at chili heads and I'm not looking at infrequent chili consumers. I'm getting people who like a little heat to their salsa, but not a lot. And I ask them how much they like. I might do a comparison between a market leader. And so what we can see is there's this big white space right here in the middle. That's the just about right. So that means more than half of the people that I brought into the lab said the market leader was just about right. Compare that instead to prototype number 1. So when we look at prototype number 1, what we find is that over half of my sample says there's too much cilantro in this. There's just too much. My product developers overdid it. We put too much in there. Versus if we look at prototype 2, we see a really big white region. That's actually good in this case, because that means we have very thin tails. We're not very polarizing in either direction. There's not a lot of people who said there's too much, and there's not a lot of people who said there's too little. So in this case, I would probably launch prototype 2. However, this is actually a business decision, not a scientific question, because maybe instead we've decided that there's an untapped market niche, and we actually want to launch prototype 1. We recognize it's polarizing, but instead we've decided that we're actually going to make an extra cilantro version. So it's a mild salsa, so it's not very, the heat is quite low, but instead we're specifically targeting people that want a lot of cilantro, even knowing that other consumers are not going to like it. So one of the psychographic variables that we wanted to look at in our laboratory almost a decade ago now is we wanted to explore this whole question between personality traits and how much you like foods that burn. So this is just overall burning sensation. It could be in the context of salsa, but it could be in the context of kimchi, or it could be barbecue ribs, or it could be buffalo wings. It could be anything that's a spicy food. And what we actually found for human behavioral data, this is an incredibly strong correlation. What we actually find is how much you like oral burn is actually predicted by a personality trait known as sensation seeking. So we use the standardized personality tool that has been published and validated to measure this trait called sensation seeking, which is sort of related to risk taking and to thrill-seeking behaviors. So you can think of this: do you like to drive fast on a twisty road? Do you like to ride a roller coaster? And so on. And so what we find is that people that are higher in sensation seeking as a personality trait tend to like spicy food more. But this was specific to spicy food. So we don't find that it's just people that are higher sensation seeking like all foods more, because we looked at other control foods like vanilla milkshakes and chicken wings and hamburgers, And we found absolutely no relationship between the personality trait and liking for those foods. So it's not as if this personality trait just says you like foods more. It says that it's specific that you like spicy foods more. And then we looked at how much people ate. And as we expected, people who like a food more, eat a food more. This is a relationship that's been shown on multiple continents by multiple researchers going back multiple decades, back to the 1950s. This is a very well-known correlation that we expect to find, but it's still good to see it in our data. But I will draw your attention to one little point in the bottom right corner. So what I'm showing you on the x-axis here is how often you eat spicy food on an annualized basis. We've done a little bit of math to that to bring the values in so that we're not comparing once a year to 365 times a year. So we've just taken the square root of the number to compress that range a little bit to clean up the statistics. But what we find is that there's a very strong positive relationship between how much you like it and how much you eat it. But I will also draw your attention to this empty quadrant in the bottom right. And the reason I want to draw your attention to this empty quadrant in the bottom right is what we find out is that when you really don't like something, you don't eat it. So people often say you like what you eat, but the reality is that's not quite true. There's a little more nuance to it. It's that you don't eat what you don't like. Because I may like a really great marbled steak and I might like a really expensive French Bordeaux red wine, but I'm not going to eat those every day because I can't afford to, because my cardiologist tells me not to. So just because I like something doesn't mean I will eat it. However, if I really, really hate something, I'm never going to eat it. I don't like sauerkraut, so I'm never going to eat sauerkraut, regardless of how much it costs or how available it is or the health consequences. I'm just not going to eat it. And so what we actually see, this is some data from, again, US Army troops that was collected about 20 years ago. But what we can see is that same 9-point hedonic scale for rating how much we like foods. These are how much of the military rations the troops eat in the field. And what we see is that anything that's neutral or above, people ate 90% or more of it, especially so if you're hungry. But you could say, well, maybe that's just soldiers in the field. They're hungry. They'll eat anything as long as it's not really gross. But we see the exact same data in university students. We see it in preschoolers. So this is a very robust effect. However, what's kind of interesting about this is if you then offer people the exact same meal, the exact same entree, because the Army can do this because they give you, MRE number 17, which might be, I don't know what that is, but let's say it's ham slice. Maybe you really like ham slice, so you rate that you like it in an 8 on a 9-point scale, and you really like that ham slice, and you eat all of the ham slice. But what we find when you actually look at when you're offered it a second time, what we actually find is that even if you like it an 8 on a 9-point scale, you'll still only pick that same entree less than 50% of the time the next time you're offered it. So again, this fits in with this idea that we don't eat foods that we don't like, but just because we like something doesn't mean that we're going to eat it every single day. So coming back to our question of spicy food intake, what we actually find is that there's consistent segmentation between frequent consumers and infrequent consumers. And this is a study that we did with some Dutch colleagues, and we took chicken broth and we spiked it with capsaicin, which is again the chemical that makes chili peppers hot. And what we found is that the burn is actually more intense in the infrequent consumers. And this was an effect we expected to see because this was shown in the 1980s. In the United States. It's been shown in my laboratory here at Penn State. As I said, this is data from Dutch colleagues. It's been shown in Australia. So this is a very robust effect that people who eat chili frequently actually experience less burn. So there really is a bit of tolerance that you can develop. But the other thing that we find is we also find differences in liking. And so we find here that if I just give you the chicken broth by itself, it's kind of boring. It's chicken broth. But if I put a little bit of burn into it, it actually makes it more interesting. And both frequent consumers and infrequent consumers like it more. But then if I keep increasing the concentration, now I've gone too far. I've exceeded that bliss point. It's too hot. And my frequent consumers still like it, but they don't like it as much as they like the lower level, where the infrequent consumers, now they don't like it because it's just too darn hot for them. So these are the examples of the kind of data that we can collect. So it turns out that when we actually brought people into the lab and put them into a 17-day clinical trial where we randomized them to a control group or we randomized them to a treatment group, and we had them take a capsaicin mouthwash every single day for 14 days. So they got 28 exposures. We were able to bring them back into the lab, and the group that had gotten a bitter chemical as a control and done a bitter mouthwash 28 times, from day 1 or day 0 to day 14, there was no change in their burn ratings when we challenged them with different amounts of capsaicin in the laboratory. But when we brought the people in who had had that mouthwash for 28 times over 14 days, we actually saw about a 25% reduction in the burn for those people. So this was data showing that you actually can build up this tolerance. So we knew that there was this cross-sectional difference from data going back 30 years, but no one had ever actually shown that you could do this experimentally with low doses. So we went one step further because, as you heard in the intro, my lab likes to use people to study product, but we also use product to study people. So we go in both directions. We actually took tongue biopsies on these individuals, and we actually scooped out a little bit of tongue tissue. And then we went looking for the amount of that TRPV1 receptor, with the idea being that maybe if you get exposed to this, your body would actually down-regulate how much there is, that you would actually make less of it. And then if you made less of that in your tongue, then you wouldn't be as sensitive to the same amount of capsaicin when we gave it to you 14 days later. But lo and behold, when we did that, we found absolutely no effect. So we weren't able to explain this based on this specific biological change. So we're continuing this work. This is active research, but we're trying to figure out what is actually going on to explain that 20 to 25% reduction in burn that we get. Which brings me to the very practical question of, well, what do you do when you overdo it, when you just have too much? And so there's a lot of folk wisdom on this. There had been some other scientific studies on this, but no one had answered this question really definitively. What data was out there did support the idea that everyone's folk intuition that milk is the best is probably true. So what we did is we actually brought people into the lab. And so Gabby, who was an undergrad researcher, getting some experiential learning in our lab, she designed this experiment working with one of my doctoral students, who's now since graduated. And so what Gabby did was she actually gave people, we went out and we bought every Bloody Mary mix that we could find on the market, and we brought them into the lab and we tasted all of them just at the benchtop, and we picked the absolute spiciest one we could find. And so when we gave people the spiciest Bloody Mary mix we could find, then we either had them do absolutely nothing and just rate the burn every minute for every 10 seconds for 2 minutes. And so that's that black line at the top with the open circles that you can see. So that is the decay and burn over time over 2 minutes. We had those same people do this 7 more times. So this was a very brutal experiment. They sat in the lab for about 45 minutes, waiting for each time for the burn to completely go away. So we really had to thank their heroic engagement of our participants, our volunteers who did this study. But we, on the 7 other trials, we either gave them seltzer, so that's carbonated, thinking that maybe the bubbles will help clear it out. But on the other side, maybe the carbon dioxide in that carbonation is actually an irritant by itself. We gave people non-alcoholic beer. We used room temperature water. We tried Coca-Cola, which is both sweet and has phosphoric acid in it. So we were trying to figure out what was going on there. Maybe that would work. We use Kool-Aid, which has citric acid in it. So it's sour, which causes you to salivate, but it's also a sugar and it's sweet and has that fruity aroma. And then we used whole milk and we used skim milk. And what we found is that as soon as you put cold whole milk or skim milk into your mouth, you cut the burn almost in half relative to doing absolutely nothing. If you even just use room temperature water, you still get a pretty good improvement. So in some ways, just the act of rinsing it all will help. But we definitely find that cold milk works better. And then when we went out to the end of 2 minutes, we found that the burn had now actually dropped to about 1/7 of its original burn. So you really can get some improvement, but we're also showing you here with the blue lines, the light blue and the dark blue, that's whole milk and that's skim milk. Now you may not know, if you're not a food scientist, that whole milk is actually only about 3.5% fat. So we're actually comparing about 3.5% fat to about 0.5% of fat or less. Some skim milk is really close down to 0. Other legally, it just needs to be below 0.5% to be called skim milk. And so we're comparing them. And so what we see is that the milk really does help. So everyone's intuition about that is right, but everyone always claims this is because of the fat in milk. And we're actually showing that the fat level between the hole in the skin doesn't really seem to matter. So it's just the milk itself. So that got us questioning, well, what else could this be? What other constituents are there in milk that could potentially interact with the capsaicin? And so we did a follow-up study. And so Bridget Farrow was a graduate student who worked on this project. So she took the two most abundant proteins in milk. She took micellar casein, and then she also took whey protein isolate. So if you've ever seen those, protein stuff for folks that go to the gym a lot, those are often whey protein isolate. Or, frankly, this is what Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet and eating her curds and whey. The whey is the milk protein that's in there after you make cheese. And so what Bridget did was she actually mixed either micellar casein with capsaicin, or she mixed whey protein isolate with capsaicin. And we were just trying to do this as a proof of concept. And you can see that the red line on the left is showing you how much burn you get from just 5 parts per million of capsaicin if you do this over 2 minutes. So a very similar design to the other one. And 2%, mixture of 2% and 5% capsaicin, you get a drop in burn. And then if you use 5%, you get even more of a drop in burn. And then the gray line at the bottom is showing you that when you have micellar casein by itself without any capsaicin, there isn't any burn. So that's just a negative control. And so what we can see from this is that adding a protein that's found in milk will actually it will actually complex with the capsaicin, prevent it from getting to the receptors, and reduce the burn. Now, we did this in a mixture, and then we see the exact same thing for the whey protein, although in this case, the high level of protein and the low level of protein, one doesn't seem to be better than the other because maybe you've just completely sucked up all the binding sites. There aren't any left. We don't really haven't figured that part out yet. But in both cases, what we find is when you compare a solution with 5% capsaicin by itself versus 5% capsaicin with protein, the burn is less. And then we also did this as a rinse, just like in the previous study, and the effects were smaller, but we did find that adding protein seems to help clean up the burn. So this is an example of how we can work top down and bottom up using model systems, using real foods, and using people to study product and product to study people to really advance our fundamental understanding of both human perception and how consumers interact with food so that we can make better food products that people like. So with that, I'll stop the slideshow and I'm happy to answer any questions. Paul, I think you're muted. There we go. Nope.
All right, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that presentation. We do have a lot of questions coming in, but maybe I'll start with where you kind of ended. You were talking about different liquids that might reduce the burn. But Charlie Wayne has a question. Have you done any research on pure sugar reducing the burn? That seems to work for him, or other types of foods that might reduce the burn either better or the same as some of the liquids you've talked about.
Sure. So, this, like I said, this was a experiential learning project for Gabby, one of our undergraduates. We're doing some follow-up work here, but we haven't systematically gone through and tried everything under the sun. I'd really love to do things with even higher protein contents at some point. Like I'd like to use Greek yogurt. I've thought about things that are high in fat, like hummus, mango lassi. You're looking to cultures that eat spicy foods and what do they pair with those foods. Right. Pure sugar, certainly we can look at the sugar a little bit in the context of both milk has some sugar in it, right? It has the lactose. And then also the Kool-Aid had sugar in it. So maybe some of the effect is there because we do elsewhere we know that sugar increases the pleasantness. So it may be that then that's impeding process where if you increase the pleasantness by adding a little bit of sweetness, then that brings the pain down. In newborn infants, there's a phenomenon known as sucrose analgesia. So they'll actually give newborn babies a little bit of sugar and it actually acts as a painkiller. It doesn't seem to work in adults though. So whether or not sucrose or another sugar is working to directly block the pain or just increase the pleasantness, we don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there might actually be some science behind why we pair sour cream with some of our more spicier food dishes.
Absolutely, that sour cream is gonna help cut that. Sourness causes salivation, so that's gonna cause more flushing right there. So you start to think about food pairings. So much of this work has really focused on industrial food products because that's who funds the work. But then there's the questions about why do we pair certain foods with others? Like why does cheap champagne actually goes really well with pepperoni pizza. And that's because the acidity of that cheap champagne and the carbonation helps cut through the grease. Or the other way around, like why we like a big bold red wine, something that's really astringent with a high fat meaty dish. There is some science behind some of that food pairing.
I have not tried the pepperoni pizza with the cheap champagne, but I'll put that on my list to try that one. Audra has a couple related really good questions here. So do taste and preferences really change as we age?
That's a tricky question. So there's the whole confusion between taste, smell, and flavor, because in English, we don't really distinguish between those terms particularly well. So when I say this tastes good, I'm actually talking about the flavor, which is both taste on the tongue, it's both the chemosensation, that oral burn that we're talking about, but it's also the smell of the odorants actually go through the back of your throat and they get up into your nose and they activate the receptors up here. That's why when you have a cold, things quote unquote don't taste right. Your sense of taste actually works fine. You can still taste salty and sour and sweet on the tongue when you have a cold, but when you're blocked up, all those volatile aromatics that go up and through the retronasal route, we can't smell those anymore. And we know that smell decreases with aging. So some of the changes in preference could be actually permanent smell loss. Of course, 2 years ago, nobody knew the word anosmia. And post-COVID, now we've heard so much about people that lose their sense of smell permanently due to viral infections like COVID-19. And so, we're starting to, it's been a very active area of research. There is some older data that some bitterness may go down with aging. So people have speculated, maybe that's why you like bitter beers or you like your Brussels sprouts more when you're older. But even then, that appears to be specific to some of it. So we need to separate the biology from the learning, because nobody comes out of the womb liking a hoppy IPA or a creamy Guinness. But I will tell you, people definitely, capitalism tells us that people like those and have learned to like those. So some of it's learning, some of it's biology, and trying to unpack that interaction can be a little tricky.
And that also seems to explain why you might taste or feel spicy foods in different ways, right? If you're having a spicy hot wing, for example, you're going to taste that more in your mouth and tongue than maybe like a horseradish, which sometimes we do feel in our upper sinuses.
Yeah, so I didn't have time to get into it, but actually that's a great question, because if we were to flip back to that slide where I showed you all the different trip channels, wasabi and garlic and horseradish activate a different trip receptor that's called trip A1. And so you actually have a different chemical that's activating a different receptor, which is why the burn is different. So you think about chili burn, it's long, it lingers, it's in the mouth, versus that trip A1 mediated mustard oil, horseradish, wasabi burn. It's much more quick onset and offset. It really feels like it clears out your sinuses, and you go from there because it's a different chemical activating a different receptor.
So sticking with Audra's questions, do companies change the taste of an established product on purpose, or are we experiencing it differently, or is it a change in ingredients? One of the things that comes to mind in this question is, how McDonald's French fries have changed the way they taste over years. And I know that has to do with the ingredient that they're cooking it in. But
Right.
from a consumer perspective, are companies tweaking their ingredients, tweaking their recipes to be more more intentionally
Yeah,
pleasing to
so
the audience,
this is a
right?
very unsatisfying answer, but it depends. So some of them, like iconic brands, they really try not to mess with them because they know that the complaint hotline is going to light up, or today social media is going to light up, and they're going to get blasted on Pinterest and on Twitter for changing the formulation. That said, food companies are always reformulating, and they're often doing it to, maybe there's a packaging change. Maybe there's a processing change where they want to use less water because the Colorado River is running dry. Maybe they are trying to take salt out to make it a little healthier. So, I've had former students that work for General Mills, and rule one when you work in Big G at General Mills is you don't mess with Cheerios, right? Like Cheerios is a flagship, iconic product. You don't reformulate that. But if you wanted to take some sugar out of, the Frankenberry that's a seasonal product once a year that no one's going to remember from last time, certainly you could take some of that sugar out. So food companies are always tweaking that. And then also, as we've all seen from supply chain disruptions, maybe there's a hurricane or cyclone that devastates the vanilla crop in Madagascar. And now where are we going to get vanilla to put in our vanilla ice cream? And so we have to switch suppliers who uses a different source. Right. And that's going to change it too. So, it's a complex ecosystem of ingredient suppliers and raw material commodities and processing that give us the modern food system.
So maybe a different take on that same question. Mel is asking regarding regional differences in taste. Do companies actually market different formulas of the same product in different areas? I'm thinking of, if you've ever been to the World of Coke in Atlanta, right? They have right. Cokes from around the world, right. And yet they still market it in each of those countries as Coke. So is there something to that?
Yeah, there is. So sometimes they are the same product and it is just psychological. Like people are really hung up on the idea that Mexican Coke is better than US Coke. A lot of that is probably due to the fact that it's a glass bottle. It's sweetened with cane sugar instead of corn syrup. So people make a big deal about that. But then how much of it is in a blind taste test, can you really tell them apart? And so, there's the psychology of the expectation versus the actual formulation. But in other cases, they really do use different formulations. So, it's, I haven't stayed abreast of it, so I don't know if they still do, but there was a point in time where Wrigley used a very different mint flavor profile in Asia than it did in North America. Because even though it was still a mint chewing gum, what they found was that people liked, between the blend of spearmint and peppermint and all the other, and wintergreen and all the other different mints that you can have, that Asian consumers just generally liked a different mint than North American consumers.
So I'm thinking that the answer for these next two questions might need more information, but Marjorie Hoffman is asking, why does balsamic vinegar taste so good? And Lynn Ovalman is asking, why do I dislike the taste of cilantro? We probably need more information about each of them, right?
Well, so these are good questions. The balsamic vinegar one, forgive me, I'm going to give you 20 seconds of food processing so you can understand this. So when you make a wine, you start with a sugar source, you feed that sugar to yeast, they turn that into alcohol, and then different microorganisms turn that alcohol into acetic acid, vinegar. In the case of most wines today, we ferment them all the way dry, and then if we want it to be sweet, we add a little sugar back. In the traditional balsamic vinegar process, what you actually do is you start with grapes, which are really high sugar. They're one of the highest sugar fruits that we have, up near 20%. And then you cook the must. And so you cook that and you bring the sugar all the way up over like 30%. So the must is really, really, really sweet. And they take a lot of care not to accidentally caramelize that sugar. Then they ferment it. That turns it into alcohol. then they let the microorganisms turn that into vinegar, just like with white wine vinegar or apple cider vinegar. It's all the same process. The difference with balsamic vinegar is that there's a lot of residual sugar left in balsamic vinegar. And so balsamic vinegar has actually got all those gorgeous aromatics that also contribute to the sweet flavor profile, but there is sugar in there. And so then this brings us to the fact that we don't like sourness by itself, but we really like sour when it's paired with sweet. And so you get that balance. Think about like, a good wine where you can feel a little bit of the acidity here, but it's still a little bit sweet. Or you just think about, even like a Jolly Rancher or Kool-Aid, right? We talked about Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid has citric acid and sugar in it. It's that sweet sugar ratio. It's that sugar sour ratio. Right. And so balsamic vinegar is very intentionally made to have some of that residual sweetness left. Whereas something like, I've never measured the sugar content, but I bet white wine vinegar has no sugar left in it at all. Right. So there you go. There's 3 minutes of food history and food processing to answer that question. And then the other question was about cilantro, and that actually comes back to genetic differences. You and I don't actually taste things the same way. We don't smell things the same way. We don't feel things in the mouth the same way. So the best way to demonstrate to yourself is the next time you go to the diner, pick up the pink packet, pick up the blue packet, and taste each of them. Everyone will find the blue packet to be sweet. Some people will find the pink packet to be sweet by itself, and others will find the pink packet to be both sweet and bitter. And that's because of genetic differences in the bitter taste receptors that are activated by that pink packet. Well, the same thing is probably happening with cilantro. No one's going to give you $2 million worth of federal research money to go figure out why people don't like cilantro. But 23andMe has poked at this a little bit for fun, just using data they already have. And it seems like there's a specific odor receptor gene that may have a different variant. So some people with one version of the gene may find cilantro to be soapy, and other people find it to be really clean and fresh based on the smell receptor, the genetic version of the smell receptor that they have. So that's why some people, but then, as we said, it's always biology and experience, right? Because we're also thinking about prior experience. So if you grew up eating cilantro, like many people don't even realize that cilantro in this country is coriander leaf in Europe, and that coriander seed is what we call coriander in English in North America. So cilantro and coriander are actually different parts of the same plant. So then you go to Europe and you end up with cilantro. Nobody knows what cilantro is, but they know what coriander leaf is. So it gets even more confusing about cultural exposure to these things. So there's biology and there's behavior based on prior experience.
So speaking of like biology and like body chemistry, if you will, I know if we go out to Brothers and we get pizza and we get an order of garlic knots, right? My wife will often comment that she can smell the garlic on her skin hours later, right? We all know about the reputation that asparagus has in changing some bodily outcomes. Can you speak to the impact that certain foods have on our body chemistry?
Sure, yeah. So some of it is literally, the garlic one, those molecules are really, really potent. You can smell them at really low concentrations and your body doesn't process them. So then they just hang around, and then when you sweat the next day, they come out of your pores on your skin. And that's when your wife says, man, you stink like the garlic we had last night, right? So like that's totally one possibility. The asparagus one's even more interesting. Again, this is one of the things that no one's going to give you a couple $1 million to figure out the genetics, but the people that have poked around at this question, because it's such a fascinating question. So for those of you that have no idea what this question is referring to, some people make an unpleasant smell in their urine after they eat asparagus. So those are the excretors. So you eat the asparagus, and within 20 minutes, your urine has a strong characteristic odor of that is literally just known as asparagus pea smell, right? And so some people make that, but not everybody makes it. So there are people that don't make that smell. And then to be that odor in their urine. And then to be even more complicated, it turns out there's people that smell it and people that don't smell it. So in theory, it could be possible that you make it, but don't smell it. So you don't know you make it. So then you go to your friend's house and now you're stinky and you have no idea you're stinky.
Right.
But yeah, so that one is, there's two different factors. One is whether you make it or not. And then the other is if you smell it or not. Somebody should do, maybe you can put that in your dating profile for your online dating apps of like, that you do or don't, because I can imagine that's a real shock the first time if you've never smelled it because you're a non-excreter, and then all of a sudden you start cohabitating with somebody that does make that smell. You're like, what the hell is that?
So we all have that friend, right? That when you go out to eat, they want to order the spiciest dish, right? And the spicier the better for them, right? And certainly that, based on what you're talking about, there's some personal preference to that, right? But have you found that there are some addicting qualities to the spice level in food?
Yeah, so people have talked about this for literally decades of, well, maybe it's addictive. I mean, so there's two issues here. One is people say it's analogous to a runner's high, that, maybe it's this endorphin release. So there's been a lot speculated on that. There's no solid data whatsoever. And then the other issue that I have with that as someone who's worked and trained in addiction science, when I was a postdoc, the definition of addiction, I use the psychosocial definition that says there has to be recurring harm due to engaging in repeated consistent behavior. And so I am 100% caffeine dependent. I drink way too much coffee and I get a headache when I don't drink that coffee. But I am not addicted to coffee because there's no psychosocial harm. My wife does not get mad at me for going to Dunkin' Donuts to get a coffee, right? And so even how you define the word addiction, I hate to be fussy about that, but eating really spicy food is not going to make you lose your job or destroy your marriage. And so, I want to be careful about using a really loaded term like addiction. And then on top of that, yeah, it's really easy to say, oh, it's probably activating opioid receptors in the brain because it's causing endorphins to be released. You can find a lot of speculation on that. I don't know of a single study that actually looks at that in a systematic way.
So final question here. Michael Mazenko is asking, when you use terms like mild and medium and hot, they're really subjective based on the individual, right? Has the market or has any of the industries looked at a better indicator of spiciness? He's suggesting maybe Scoville units, or I know in your research you use 1 to 10 on some of those scales. But would that better help consumers, or is that even subjective?
So there's actually, I literally teach an undergraduate class in this, so I'll spare you the gory details. But psychologists have figured out ways to actually make valid measurements of intensity across people. And they do this with a technique called cross-modal matching. So what I do is I play a sound for you and I ask you how intense that sound is, and then I give you something to taste. And then I compare the ratio of the sound I've played for you, or the taste, or maybe the brightness of the light. And by doing that, it's not just subjective. In fact, there's a crazy experiment from the 1960s you would never get through an ethics board today, where they actually cut the middle ear. In the middle ear, they cut a taste nerve as it runs to the tongue because they needed to get it out of the way for the surgery. So this wasn't just an experiment. This was normal clinical treatment. But that gave them the opportunity to record from the taste nerve on the front of the tongue. And what they actually found was then they gave those same people different citric acid and sugar water to taste. The nerve firing from their tongue matched the numbers that they were actually able to give it in the experiment. So you can actually show that the nerve event in a awake human actually matches the number of people it can give. In terms of Scoville units, it's kind of tricky because it's great marketing and everyone wants to put it on their label. It's really not that useful for what we're talking about here, because all Scoville units ends up being as a concentration. And they figure that out using chromatography, and then they just do a math conversion factor, turn the amount of this capsaicinoid and this capsaicin and the dihydrocapsaicin, and they plug it into a formula and they get a number. The problem with this, that ignores what the volume is, what the serving temperature is, and what your prior experience is. So you and I can have I can take pure capsaicin, 5 ppm, put it in a solution, give you a 10 ml sample at the exact same temperature, and you and I will experience it differently based on our prior exposure. And the fact that we're experiencing it differently tells me there is no one number like a Scoville number that I can use. At best, it's an average based on a concentration from an instrumental measurement.
So if alumni want to learn more about your research or the work that you're doing, or the center that you run, where can they go to find that?
So you can find me on Twitter at TasteProf. You can look at the Department of Food Science website, and you can find my faculty webpage there. You can look at the Department of Food Science website, and there's a subsection for the Sensory Evaluation Center. In fact, I think if you just Google Penn State Sensory Evaluation Center, it'll pop right up. We have we're not super active with it, but we do have a presence on Facebook, so you can look at that. We have a presence on Instagram, so you can look at that. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter, and you can find me through the Department of Food Science. Our lab's right above the Berkeley Creamery, so if you've ever been to University Park and had an ice cream cone, chances are you know where we work. So
excellent. Hey, help us learn a little bit more about you. Explain the lacrosse stick behind you.
Oh, I grew up in Syracuse. And Glenn Thiel, who was the Penn State varsity coach for many, many decades, lives down the street from me. And he was cleaning out one day, and I was riding my bike to campus, and he had a bunch of vintage sticks sitting out on the curb. And I was like, oh, I need one of those, because when I was a kid growing up in Syracuse, I used to play against kids on the Onondaga Reservation. And man, that was talk about an amazing experience to play against those kids with hand carved sticks. So to have one, I thought was cool.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. John Hayes for joining us. And I'd also like to thank all of you who tuned in to today's virtual speaker session. As a reminder, you can view the full listing of all of our events online and in person at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thank you for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are
Penn State.